Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics and the wider Horn of Africa region. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and co-producer here on HORUFADHI Media, alongside Suleiman Hashi. On this week's program, President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud of Somalia returns from a trip across the Horn of Africa region, visiting regional neighbours including Djibouti, Kenya and Eritrea. The president has signed two major agreements with neighbouring Eritrea and Kenya, and controversially signing off the return of the miraa trade, among other things. What was signed between leaders in Asmara and Nairobi? And in this episode, we will delve into and provide a critical analysis of both of these agreements. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share. For similar content, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. Also, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media Group's second channel, known as HORUFADHI TV, where you can find exclusive programs such as the African Weekly Roundup and Mahahi Salah, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider HORUFADHI Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Let's get straight into it. The Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud has returned from Djibouti yesterday as he continues his tour of the Horn of Africa region and Somalia's neighbours. The President began his overseas tour on the 19th of June, where he took his first official trip abroad to the United Arab Emirates and met Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed. This first trip would see a major shift in foreign policy relations, as the previous Somali government had frosty relations with Abu Dhabi, relations restored by former Prime Minister Mohammed Hussein Roble. Therefore, for the President of Somalia to travel to the UAE first is a major contrast to the status quo that has been in place since 2018. But one has to remember that the incumbent president has closer relations with the leadership of Abu Dhabi, in contrast to the previous administration, which had warmer relations with Doha and Qatar. Now, following the contraction of and recovery from COVID-19, President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud would set course for Turkey on the 3rd of July, where he met Turkish President Erdogan in Ankara. In addition to meeting the Turkish government, the president also visited Somali's troops stationed in Isparta. Now, Villa Somalia announced discussions held in Ankara stretching across different sectors, including security, training of Somali forces, humanitarian support, and increasing Turkish investment in Somalia, and as well as increasing Somali businesses and investment in Turkey. Now, aside from governmental meetings, the president also attended and gave a speech at the headquarters of the Foundation for Political, Economic and Social Research, known as CETA, where he raised benefits of Somali-Turkish cooperation. CETA is a policy think tank based in Ankara. Now, in his speech, the president would highlight a major foreign policy strategy that he intends to put in place in Somalia, which would see Somalia act as a gateway for Turkish access into Africa, and possibly Somalia becoming a greater gatekeeper, both geographically and politically, between the sub-Saharan Africa region and the Middle East. July 9th, in a statement that surprised many, Villa Somalia announced that President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud planned to travel to Eritrea on an official 4-day visit in which he would meet his Eritrean counterpart, President Afwerki, as well as meet Somali National Army soldiers that were training in that country for the last 3 years. Now, for over a year, many Somali politicians that were opposed to the former government led by President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, including the current incumbent President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, argued that Somali units stationed in Eritrea took part in a conflict in neighbouring Tigray region of Ethiopia. However, footage and images circulated by state media both in Eritrea and Somalia showed what appeared to be 5,000 soldiers safe and well, with the president himself saying the soldiers that he and so many others claimed were fighting in Tigray were actually not, and were actually healthy and safe. Now, in a statement by both Villa Somalia and the Eritrean Information Ministry, it was outlined that the president visited Somali troops that received the 3-year training. Hassan Sheikh visited and inspected a parade of the members of the SNA. Representatives of trainees paid tribute to the rigorous program of training and lessons according to the Eritrean Information Ministry. Now, sources have confirmed that some of those soldiers will be forming part of a special commando unit, as well as some of that specializing in urban combat, whereas others will begin to specialize more in rural combat. Now, the president visited Somali naval forces training in the port city of Massawa. President Hassan met and inspected similarly a military parade of speedboats of members of the Somali National Navy. Now, in his message to the Navy trainees as well as the soldiers, President Hassan Sheikh expressed his highest confidence in these trainees returning to Somalia and taking part in the war against Al-Shabaab. On the final day of his trip, in a surprise to all, President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud signed a memorandum of understanding with Asmara. Now, let's take a closer look at the MoU. Now, interestingly, the memorandum of understanding begins with recognizing that the successful fight against terrorism in Somalia, and I'm quoting this, is a prerequisite for peace and stability in the Horn of Africa region. Now that's an important point because it highlights that the main point of this agreement, the crux or the bedrock, so to speak, of the agreement between Eritrea and Somalia is finding peace and stability in the region that benefits both countries. Now, some of the more important points included in this agreement are, for example, strengthening political and diplomatic cooperation to protect and advance national interests for both countries. A second point includes broaden economic and social cooperation with emphasis on trade, investment, water security, agricultural fisheries, health and education. Now, all of these points are important because investment Somalia needs. Somalia has an issue with water security. We have continuous droughts and countless of Somalis who continue to die from thirst and a lack of water, despite Somalia having the longest coast in Africa. Agricultural fisheries. Somalia has a very, very poor fishing and fisheries industry. There is little investment, little technology, little business in this area, and the government hasn't really taken the steps forward to kind of initiate other companies or initiate businesses to start in the fisheries industry. So this is another important element. And finally, health and education, which are both important elements in Somalia, which are lacking because Somalia heavily relies on NGOs for its health sector and heavily relies on NGOs for its education sector. In reality, Somalia's education sector is quite abysmal in the sense that many of the educations and institutions are private institutions and are not effectively governed by the education ministry. They fail to provide finances for these institutions, for example. And finally, the last point, enhance advanced security cooperation to safeguard peace, stability and security in the region. And this, of course, comes into the element of Eritrean troops training Somali troops in Eritrea, and we've seen now 5,000 soldiers returning back to Somalia in due course. And finally, and probably the most significant point, is the final bullet point, which states the advancement of cordial relations, cooperation and economic integration of the Horn of Africa. And this is possibly an indication of a continuation of the three-way partnership between Ethiopia, Eritrea and Somalia, although it seems as though Ethiopia and Somalia relations could deteriorate as a result of the political conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, which continues to intensify, and it seems as though Somalia is becoming caught in the middle of it. While it hasn't just yet, siding with a particular side in this conflict will only lead to issues for Somalia, particularly siding with Egypt, because Egypt doesn't have a border with Somalia, Ethiopia doesn't. Having an enemy directly at its border is not good for Somalia in any way whatsoever, and we've seen this for the last 30 years. Now, we have to give credit where credit is due, and the President Hassan Sheikh made an exceptional foreign policy decision here to strengthen relations with Eritrea. The reality is the crux of peace, security and prosperity in the Horn of Africa is based upon a unified and stable Somalia. Somalia currently is the heart of insecurity in North Africa. Food insecurity, water insecurity, terrorism, previously piracy, a lack of government, militia, it's uncountable. Now, having a Somalia which is both economically and politically stable is the only logical solution to finding any kind of peace in the Horn of Africa region. Somalia, for example, could play a key role currently in facilitating talks between Djibouti and Asmara. Much like the East African community centered on the Great Lake, a similar Horn of Africa group could be formed comprising of Horn of Africa states. And some of the main points they could work on, for example, is they could create a free market access for all member states, like we've seen in the European Union, where Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and even possibly Kenya could be part of a free market system where all can gain financially from that market. Another point could be a relaxed borders to allow easy flow of people and goods, much like the Schengen zone in the European Union again. And this would allow businesses to thrive across borders, because the reality is communities in Eritrea, communities in Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, and even Kenya are all mixed. The borders are artificial. People that live across each side of the border regularly walk across and regularly have family, meet family, do business in Ethiopia or in Somalia or in Kenya or in Djibouti or in Eritrea. So these people are interconnected regardless of whether there's borders or not. So having a relaxed border system would be very beneficial. And lastly, aligned foreign policy and more unified security apparatus. And this is important because this would allow us to weed out security issues in particularly parts of the continent, of the region, for example, southern Somalia or parts of Djibouti or parts of Ethiopia or even parts of Kenya or Eritrea, for example, a unified military, we can see in the Arab League right now where the Arab League is attempting to develop a unified military Arab army to kind of provide a policing unit for the Arab League in a sense. And this could also be beneficial for the Horn of Africa. In, like, for example, currently we have ATMIS, but having a more localized, centralized military army in the Horn of Africa, a unified army which understands more the intrinsic issues that face the region, would be beneficial, in my opinion. Now, while this is idealistic, an organization such as this would, I believe, ensure prosperity and stability in the Horn of Africa region for at least decades. And I commend and support the president on this endeavor that he's taken, the direction he's taking with Eritrea. However, much like I have highlighted the positives of the trip to Eritrea, we must equally highlight the negative stigma regarding this trip. And many of our viewers are probably aware that as a presidential candidate, the incumbent president Hassan Sheikh Mohamud joined other presidential candidates and political analysts that Somali troops training in Eritrea were directly deployed to Ethiopia and allegedly died during combat in Tigray. However, in a press conference today, the president's spokesperson Abdikarim Ali Kar outright denied the Somali troops ever partook in the Tigray conflict or had even died, instead claiming such claims are nonsense and bogus. This, however, poses a serious question. One, where did President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud and other presidential candidates in the CPC at the time obtain the information that Somali soldiers fought and died in Tigray? Two, how did the incumbent president validate these claims before going public and condemning the Somali government and armed forces? Now, if this was just a political campaign, I wholeheartedly condemn such a campaign as it erodes trust in the government and its institutions rather than actually undermine a political candidate or a challenger. It dismantles the fragmented and fragile government of Somalia and places this government in unnecessary international spotlight and condemnation that it didn't really need at that time. So we must have an answer to this unexplained dilemma. Now over to Kenya, where the president would make his first official trip to Nairobi on the 15th of July. Now, the trip to Nairobi has by far been the most controversial trip taken by the president. Indeed, Hassan Sheikh travelled to Kenya at a time where the Somali public opinion of the Kenyatta regime has been at an all-time low. In fact, Somali-Kenyan relations have been at an all-time low since Somalia initially cut relations with Kenya in 2020 for what Mogadishu described as a blatant interference of Somali internal affairs in Jubaland, particularly during the Jubaland elections in 2019. And the newly elected president and his government have attempted to take a different approach to relations with Kenya, as the president campaign was built on the phrase Somalia at peace with the world. It was on such a basis that the president decided to diplomatically reapproach Kenya. Indeed, Hassan Sheikh continuously condemned the policy decisions taken by former President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo regarding the staunch and aggressive response he gave to Nairobi. Indeed, Hassan Sheikh instead advocated for a more relaxed response, a more open response, and a response that would allow Kenya and Somalia to at least have some form of relationship. It was the day following the inauguration ceremony of President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud that a member of the Kenyan delegation, Agricultural Secretary Peter Munya, announced that Somalia and Kenya reached an agreement regarding the miraa trade, and it would be signed at the IGAD meeting, only to be delayed. This element would formulate a large part of the bilateral agreement signed between neighboring governments only a few days ago. So following years of tensions and conflict, the rift between Somalia and Kenya seems to have been brought to a halt, at least temporarily. So who stands to gain the most from this agreement? Well, it's clear Kenya has gained the most, as all of Nairobi's demands were met by Mogadishu, while it remains unclear what exactly Somalia's demands were at the negotiation table. Let's take a look at the elements to this agreement. Now, the biggest elephant in the room is the return of miraa to Somalia. It is reported that miraa traders in Kenya were losing close to $500,000 per day due to the economic sanctions imposed by Somalia. This is a major victory for the Kenyatta regime, as Nairobi has successfully restored a major element of its local economy. Of course, President Kenyatta has been continuously promising miraa traders in northern Kenya and central Kenya that his government would return the trade of qad to Somalia, because Kenya was losing, as you can see, up to $500,000 a day. I mean, you can only imagine how much he was losing a year. So this is a major victory for Kenyatta. Indeed, the agreement does highlight fishing. However, we can see that the similar agreement with Ethiopia has not been the most successful in balancing trade between qad and fishing, although there was some transportation of fishes between Ethiopia and Somalia. Conversely, Kenya has a decently long coastline, as much as any other East African country, whereas Ethiopia is landlocked. So the reality is that Ethiopia kind of does benefit and need Somali fish, whereas why would Kenya need fishes from Somalia if it already has its own fishes? Historically, Kenyan planes landed with tons of qad and left with tons of money and not even a grain of Somali sugar. So the reality is that Kenya does not need much from Somalia. And for Hassan Sheikh and other critics of the trade deal signed by the previous administration with Addis Ababa, one would expect that his administration would be the first to ban qad importation from Ethiopia and altogether end the trade of this drug, which continues to rot Somali society to the core, particularly the youth. But this shockingly has not been done so, and instead 2 sources of qad have been opened. 2 doors of drugs are being funneled in to Somalia. Additionally, the miraa conundrum was a major leverage for Somalia to gain more from this new deal, which seems to have been completely underutilized. Now, a second element that I want to highlight is another element which is major to this agreement, which is the return of Kenya Airways to Somalia. Now, again, this is another major victory for Kenya. Why do you ask? Well, 2 major points. One, a Somali national attempting to fly to Kenya via Kenya Airways would have to wait 10 days to receive a visa and still pay $300. Now, the agreement doesn't even make it any easier for an average Somali to travel to Kenya, clearly. The reality is that more people will be flying to Nairobi from Mogadishu than Nairobi to Mogadishu, meaning that this will increase business and tourist travel to Kenya. So I fail to understand how the return of Kenya Airways benefits Somalia in any way. What it actually does is it drags away investment from Somalia, because many people look at Mogadishu, they hear what's going on with Al-Shabaab, and they think the security situation is abysmal. So what happens? A lot of businesses start fleeing Hamar. They fly to Nairobi. A lot of companies, individuals who might have been forced to set up business in Mogadishu because the border between Somalia and Kenya is closed, can now be able to go to Nairobi, set up headquarters there, and open offices in Somalia, which is not good for Somalia in any way. And finally, the final point I want to highlight is the sharing of intelligence between Somalia and Kenya, and this will involve NISA, which is the Somali Intelligence Agency, sharing information with Kenya regarding events taking place in Somalia and vice versa. Again, I fail to understand how Somalia benefits from this intelligence sharing, as it is intelligence sharing about Somalia. So aside from some minor intelligence Kenya can actually gather from Jubaland or within its own borders about Al-Shabaab activity or whatever, this doesn't actually need Kenya to gather any intelligence about its own jurisdiction. The reality is that whatever deal President Hassan Sheikh signed in Nairobi is not even actually guaranteed, as a new administration with new policies could take over Nairobi in less than 4 weeks. So the question becomes, why did the Somali president sign a deal with the outgoing president that is not even running for office? Again, that's a question that Villa Somalia can answer. Now let's look at it from Kenyatta's angle, from Nairobi's angle. For Nairobi, it's been 2 major political defeats for the past 2 years. A pledge to enforce an MoU in Nairobi, and a victory at the ICJ was completely derailed by the previous government. This was a major loss and embarrassment for Kenyatta, hence his continuous rejection of the verdict in favor of a negotiation. Kenya still refuses to acknowledge the result of the court, despite the president's spokesman claiming today at a press conference that point 1 of the agreement outlines Kenya's respect for Somalia's territorial integrity. Well, if that is the case, why didn't Kenya outline clearly in writing, say it respects and accepts the ICJ verdict? Because territorial integrity is subjective of what one believes. If Kenya believes that its territorial integrity comes into that territorial water that has been disputed and resolved, then it doesn't make any sense what the point here is. Well, if this is true, however, that Kenya is respecting Somali integrity, I'm hoping Kenya will be reversing its actions, not just in Jubaland and propping up Ahmed Madobe, but also its actions in Somaliland. Now, the previous Somali administration, like I've said previously, consistently used the miraa trade as a political chokehold on many aspects of Kenya's economy to prevent Kenya's continuous violation of Somali sovereignty in Jubaland and Somaliland. We can see this recently when Kenyatta invited Somaliland representative to an ambassadorial meeting in Nairobi, in which Somali Ambassador Mahmoud Tarsan walked out in protest, a move Nairobi has yet to apologize for. We could literally see indiscriminate bombing of Gedo, in which civilians continue to be killed and private property continues to be destroyed. Before I conclude this program, I want to leave you all with one question. What was Somalia's demands at this negotiation? And what has actually been achieved from this negotiation and agreement, aside from actually fulfilling a vague campaign slogan, Somalia being at peace with Kenya?